Donald Trump's state visit, the Labour Party's deputy leadership contest, a Liberal Democrat conference, and the meltdown of your party, plus the latest developments in the Middle East and the recognition by the UK of a Palestinian state. I'm Frank McKenna, and this is the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Hey, it worked.
So welcome back to the Downtown Den Politics Podcast with me, Frank McKenna, Jim Hancock and Joe Phillips. And in my absence last week, I attempted to get into Gardner's World, but Joe quickly brought them back into the sanity of what we're here to talk about. And of course, is all things politics. And as I said in the introduction there, we're going to be looking at the state visit of Donald Trump, the Labour Party, and its travails, including its forthcoming conference and, of course, the deputy leadership contest. We'll also be looking at those parties further to the left of Labour that appear to be taking some support from Keir Starmer's party, including the Greens, the Liberal Democrats who held their conference in Bournemouth this week, of course, and your party, my party, their party, even Zara Sultana isn't quite sure at this moment in time. And of course, the big breaking news over the weekend, the recognition of a Palestinian state, not just by the UK, but by Canada, Australia, France, Portugal, and others too. So let's get into the conversation. I just wanted to quickly reflect on the reason why I wasn't on the podcast last week, because of course, usually we record on a Monday morning, but we were hosting a West Midlands reception in Parliament, and we had leaders from across the West Mids with us, from Birmingham, from Coventry, from Wolverhampton, MPs and peers, of course. A very, very good and well-presented speech from Richard Parker, who is the Mayor of the West Midlands, who was there to launch his growth plan. And of course, we had Peter Kyle, the Business Secretary too. So an interesting afternoon of conversation, discussion. And I think you guys reflected last week, actually, very positive and upbeat. So we hear all this doom and gloom around the country, and we can often get into a doom loop. But if you were listening carefully to what not just the politicians, but the business leaders and indeed academia were saying, then in terms of the West Midlands and its future, it looks relatively bright, Joe, doesn't it?
Yeah, I thought so. But I've said it to you before, Frank. When you get outside of the London bubble and you see what is going on in the regions, particularly where there's devolved powers with the mayoralty, there is this cohesion and people working together. And I think, the fact that you've got a leading AI company alongside Aston University, alongside Richard Parker, as you say, but a whole load of other businesses across a wide spectrum. And this sense that, there is stuff to do. There is, as you said in your speech at the event, there is a light hidden under a bushel of the West Midlands. And now, they're picking that bushel off so that we can see it. And I really did get a sense of optimism and hope. And we could do with a lot more of it, frankly.
Yeah. Jim, did you enjoy the event?
Yes, I enjoyed that event and of course the Regeneration Conference the previous week, where West Midlands people, even though they were in Manchester, were very, very prominent in that conference as well. And I've put it all together on a summary report, which will be no doubt on the Downtown website. Absolutely. I mean, there was a call for more skills and to try and help the construction industry. We heard a lot about that. Trevor Stephen obviously talking about his role in mental health and so on with the construction industry. But also, I thought it was quite poignant that the workforce that have built the magnificent Hill Dickinson Stadium, which you were kind enough to invite me to last week, Frank, are all dispersed now. And there was a call for a pipeline of work so that, skilled workforces can be kept together and people can see a sort of career path rather than being hired and fired. practical things like that. But as Joe says, it's all part of a fairly optimistic view about the future for the West Midlands, and and the meeting was absolutely packed at Westminster. And I think Downtown did a good service in bringing people together, because sometimes we're working in a bit like isolation, and coming together like that and presenting the case, I think was extremely good. There was a slight feeling that sometimes the West Midlands, the CEO of Coventry Council, sort of saying, we'll put our light under a bushel sometimes and don't feel we should speak up. But if you don't speak up in this world, you don't get heard.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Joanne Roney moving to Birmingham from Manchester has helped enormously as far as that's concerned, because she knows how to sell a story. She's been doing it for 7 years in Manchester, and she's taken that experience with her to Birmingham and the wider West Midlands. So I expect to see a bit more sabre rattling from our friends in Birmingham, if I can put it that way. And good to see they've got plenty of positive things to talk about. Anyway, let's move on to the week's events in politics, because almost as impressive as Downtown's parliamentary reception of the West Midlands was the state visit of Donald Trump. On a serious note, bloody hell, we do these things well, don't we? You can criticise the UK for many things, but in terms of putting on a show, we are absolutely A1, top of the class, world class. And I thought that the whole tone of the event was pitched right. I think politically it was smart. Parliament in recess, keep him out of the capital because there's refurbs going on at Buckingham Palace. Get him somewhere else that you can show all the pomp, all the ceremony. The King's speech was pitched absolutely perfectly. Then there's an announcement the next day of £150 billion of investment from US tech giants. And of course, a press conference that could have gone horribly wrong, where actually Starmer seemed relatively comfortable, saying, well, we're going to disagree agreeably on things like, for example, Palestine. I don't think that state visit could have gone any better, Joe. And I think that one of the things that we've credited Keir Starmer for, certainly on this podcast, has been his ability to reclaim the UK's place on the world stage as a credible player. And I think we added to that reputation this week.
Oh, absolutely. And I should imagine Trump went back and has probably been watching the whole thing on a loop tape, just saying, didn't I look great? Wasn't it great? Wasn't it great that I stopped Sadiq Khan coming? No, you had no say in the thing. And if you did that, why did you have Rupert Murdoch at the state banquet? You're suing? No, it was brilliant. And I think, I'm not a monarchist, but I think the royal family absolutely played their part. It was clockwork perfect. There are a number of sort of, the biggest ever, whatever it was, honor guard and all the rest of it. First ever second state visit, unprecedented this, unprecedented that. Everybody played their part. Donald Trump was actually quite well behaved, I thought. And there is a very, as you say, Frank, quite rightly, Keir Starmer's worked really hard. And, many of us feel slightly nauseated at the sight of him cozying and kowtowing to Trump, but it works. And if it works, it's worth it. And I think the other thing that's important is that it's been very obvious to me for a long time, and before Keir Starmer became Prime Minister, that he does have a genuine relationship with the King, and as he was the Prince of Wales. And I think that is hugely helpful, because, the fact that Zelensky came to Europe after he'd been totally dissed in the White House, and then went up to the King, I think it was Sandringham, all of those things, they all help in the optics. And I think, people have been very sniffy about what did we get out of it. Well, we got a tech deal. There is still work to be done on the pharmaceutical deal, which is a much bigger deal, actually, because we've lost stuff that was promised, and that was going to lead to jobs, and people were beginning to build centres and things. But, what else can we do? We've got to deal with this man-child for the next few years. And unfortunately, we have to play his game. It's a shame that he always manages to just spoil it, just as he's leaving. he manages to say something ghastly. You know, he's like the ghastly relative, or the, you know, the old friend that we've all got that we feel kind and sorry for. We invite them in for Christmas and they give them the whole thing, and on the way out they go, you want to paint that hallway, it looks awful. There's just something, he's got to be snippy all the time. But, you know, well done to everybody involved, and I should think everybody deserved a jolly good large gin and tonic in Camilla's case, I would think.
He was given some sort of special whiskey, wasn't he, at the actual state visit? Again, the whole thing was choreographed perfectly, as you say. And again, and the other thing that's been reported is that Melania Trump has said that it was the best visit that she's ever had abroad. So again, no small feat. I think the importance of keeping Trump on side, it's hugely difficult, and as you say, somewhat distasteful for people like us at times. But it was demonstrated to me again at that reception that we held last week in Parliament, when somebody from the West Midlands, in fact 3 businessmen, said to me, and they were all men, by the way, that JLR, that deal for the car manufacturing sector in the West Midlands, literally did save hundreds of not thousands of jobs. And so, you know, their view is that sometimes people who observe politics on a regular basis through a relatively narrow lens, such as us, need to just give Starmer some slack and some credit, because it literally is saving jobs, this relationship that he's managed to somehow forge with Trump. Anyway, back to the state visit, Jim, what did you make of it?
Well, stand by, because I think we've paid a high price for our civility. Impeccable ceremonial, of course, but for the most disgraceful president in the history of the United States. He couldn't wait, as Joe says, to get on the, you know, he was well behaved at the press conference, couldn't wait to get on the plane to have another attack on the mayor of London, and also threatened to close down American broadcasting stations that had the temerity to criticize him. The whole visit was insulated from the public. What does that tell us? What should that tell Donald Trump? They couldn't even have a carriage ride through the fairly normally quiet streets of Windsor. The whole thing had to be hermetically sealed. As I say, a high price for our civility. The 25% tariff on steel still remains. The man has been made a fool of by Putin and Netanyahu, and I was desperately uncomfortable throughout the whole visit, I'm afraid.
So what would you have done, Jim?
Well, I think the state visit was ridiculously early in the presidency. I mean, we could have held it over him. We didn't have to do it in the first few months, because, you know, the chances are he might well rip up all the agreements with Starmer. He could well this agreement over.
No, Jim, you'll forget the whataboutery, because it might not. You know, at this moment in time, the result is jobs saved within the car manufacturing industry, £150 billion worth of investment for tech, and we are desperately in need of more investment into AI and future technology. There are things that we need to sort out, like steel and pharmaceuticals, no different, I have to say, to the rest of the world. So you tell me, what would you have done with that state visit? And without the state visit, what else have Britain got to offer?
Well, I mean,
it's all right being a critic from the sidelines.
No.
What I'm saying to you is, you put yourself in the position of, let's say, Morgan McSweeney, and what do you do with Trump?
I would have delayed the state. I would have handed him the infamous letter that Starmer handed to him. And the letter would have contained, "We hope to see you on a state visit later in your presidency." And then, you know, I mean, to the extent.
But we don't know what back channels have been taking place, Jim. And my guess is that Trump is no fool, despite what we might on occasion say and think, will have said, "That's great. I want this early." Because he's not getting any younger. He's not going to be wanting to go on foreign travels year 3, year 4 into his presidency. And so if he's insisted on that taking place earlier, then all that I can say, and I don't know that that's the case, but I wouldn't be surprised, then you've got to basically say, okay, because there's more that America gives to us economically, and our economy is shot after 14 years of shit show management and Brexit, of course. So what alternative was there other than to manage it in the way that they did, which is Parliament's in recess,
Yeah.
Buckingham Palace is being done up. Why would you want to? The other thing I'd have to say to you, Jim, is why would you want to subject him to protests and which again just gesture politics, not going to change the guy in any shape or form.
Well, and the other thing is that, you know, by doing it now, while Ukraine and Gaza are at such crisis point, that all the time he's got, you know, Keir Starmer has got some part of Trump's ear, not the bit that was shot off, obviously, but you know, it all the time he's got that way, with or without an ambassador, a British ambassador to the United States. There is vague hope that there might be pressure regarding Ukraine and certainly regarding Gaza. I mean, maybe not, who knows? But if you leave it another 2 years, maybe you won't have that same influence.
I just don't know what people expect from us. I don't know what you expect, Jim. You haven't given an answer other than to say you'd have delayed it.
I'm astonished that Joe has still got faith that Trump is not actually on the side of the Russians. Since that, another ghastly spectacle, which was the Anchorage summit with Putin, Putin's response to that has been to invade the airspace of Poland and Estonia and continue to shell in Ukraine. There is no prospect. Trump and Trump is increasingly making the United States like Russia. You know, some of the stuff that's going on now is really serious. As to be fair to Frank, Frank flagged this up some weeks ago, and I've been perhaps slightly late to the party. Anyway, I mean, I don't want to dodge your question. No, I mean, we will see. I think the state visit was too early, and I don't trust Trump an inch. And if there could be a falling out with Starmer big time in the next year or two, and we could be in real, yeah.
There could be, but I do think, you know, the fact that it was outside of Buckingham Palace, outside of London, outside of Parliament, meant that it minimised, you know, the potential for it becoming a chance for Trump to say, look at this country, it's going to the dogs. You know, you've got protesters, you've got all these crazy people.
The other side of that coin is to expose him to the sort of contempt that an awful lot of people in Britain have for him, and he should realise this. Not having fawning acolytes around him all the time might change the man. I don't know.
In your dreams, you might grow hair, Jim.
Jim's basically wanting the Love Actually moment, which of course no British Prime Minister would ever dare go. But hey, I think that we criticise the government often on this podcast for missteps. I think when they get something right, they deserve credit, and the state visit and the way in which they've dealt with a very, very challenging president has been as well as you could have expected. And I wonder as well, Jim, what private conversations are taking place between Starmer and Trump. Whether it's having an impact or not, we don't know. We don't know whether the Russians have got anything on the president of the United States. Let's face it, you know, it's always been rumoured. But Starmer can only, using Trump's phrase, play the cards that he's got. And in that respect, I think he's done as well a job as anybody could expect. And I do get a bit pissed off, actually, when people from the left don't acknowledge the difficulties and challenges that you have as Prime Minister of the UK. We're not the bloody Commonwealth anymore. We're not the power we used to be. And we do need that investment from the United States. And £150 billion, we're saying that could have waited another 2 years. Well, you talk to the people in tech innovation and looking to set up data centres in the UK, and I tell you, James, that's just not the case. They need that money like yesterday. So good on Keir Starmer, good on the royal family, and let's hope that those deals do come to fruition and that more jobs are created and saved. But what it has done, of course, is take off the front pages, surprisingly, and again, credit to whoever's managed this, the story that was dominating the headlines last weekend of Peter Mandelson's sacking from the job of US ambassador. Now,
someone that Donald Trump
surprisingly,
doesn't know,
Donald Trump's never met him and didn't know who he was. So that was helpful in the press conference. And I say that in all seriousness because you didn't want that press conference turning into an interrogation of the Peter Mandelson appointment if you were Keir Starmer. I'm not going to go back through the Mandelson situation again because we have discussed that previously, but I do want to lean into what last week, or the latter end of last week, means for Starmer's leadership, because of course at the same time as that was going on, the state visit, the international stage, where we all acknowledge, I think mostly, that Starmer has done a good job. He's still got his internal difficulties. Andy Burnham has been on radio programmes saying, "Oh, I'm not ruling myself out of anything in the future." He and others have set up this new group within the Labour Party, Mainstream, I think it's called. There's a deputy leadership contest, of course, kicked off as well with Lucy Powell, and you would think Keir Starmer's favourite candidate, Bridget Phillipson. Well, all the polls I'm seeing is that Lucy Powell is going to win that deputy leadership contest reasonably comfortably. So what are we making of all that? Jim, let you go first on this. Keir Starmer, good state visit, in my opinion. Has he done enough to survive? Does he have to make the speech of his life at Labour Party conference next Tuesday?
Yeah, I mean, letting the dust settle on the first section of this podcast, I absolutely acknowledge that on the international stage, Keir Starmer has done extremely well. And it does depend now on the domestic economic growth, whether he can pull the irons out of the fire. There's still a long time to go. And with a fair economic wind, things could be looking a lot different for him in the next year. But just to refer to your remark about Andy Burnham, I do think that is an important turning point for Mr. Burnham, because up to now he's sort of fluttered his eyelashes and not said very much beyond what was on the record, that I'm glad to be out of Westminster. You never get anything done there. I can get things done in Greater Manchester, and this is where I'm here to stay. The interview on BBC Radio Manchester last week, and congratulations to them to get it, was that inflection, I can't rule anything out. So he's on his way. This was the Michael Heseltine, I can't conceive of the circumstances. If people remember that, we very challenged Margaret Thatcher, and we all knew that was I'm in the race. So I'm not going to bore people again with the logistics of how Andy Burnham has to, above the noise of my cuckoo clock, apologise for that. To get back to Westminster, it's quite tricky with by-elections, and Reform will be on his tail. But I do think that's important. And also, just to remark on the rise of Lucy Powell. We've all known her for a long time, MP for Manchester Central, Commons leader, but not seen as, with great respect, as the sort of in the very first rank of Labour politicians. But clearly she's done her work behind the scenes. Is a powerful message that she put over, that she probably got sacked because she was telling Morgan McSweeney and others the things they didn't want to hear from the backbenchers. And that really goes to one of Starmer's biggest mistakes, not listening to his backbenchers. So we now know that the leader of the House of Commons was trying to convey the messages, which might have avoided the welfare car crash in the summer. And I agree with you, Frank, that I think Lucy Powell is well on track to be the deputy leader of the party, and we'll see how that relationship develops. Very important conference speech, and indeed on the Monday, from time immemorial, on the Monday we get the Chancellor's speech, and that will be quite interesting because she almost won't want to say anything because she can't because of the budget, and yet she's got to. You could argue as to which is the more important speech, actually, but she's got to say something on the Monday, and then Keir Starmer's probably got to make the performance of his life on the Tuesday. But he's not a natural conference performer, leaning over the podium and fight and all this sort of stuff. He's just not that sort of guy. He's quite stiff, but it's going to be a very interesting conference in Liverpool.
Yeah, I think it's a big conference for him and for the party, actually, because Andy Burnham will be doing fringe events. He's doing something for us on the Monday, actually. Not controversial, though. It's to launch the Mindflow Charter, which is that mental health charity that Trevor Stephen is involved in, that Jim referenced earlier, alongside Luciana Berger, actually. So we won't be getting any snippets from Andy at that about leadership challenges, I don't think. I'll try, though. I'll try. But the Lucy Powell thing, I tell you, one of the things that has pissed her off, I know, and Bridget Phillips, I'm sure, but if you are a woman in the Labour Party, this contest between two very talented politicians, let's face it, they've reached very, very high positions within the government already. Who knows, either one of them could go on to even greater things. And this contest, Joe, is being treated as a vicarious contest between Keir Starmer and Andy Burnham. It's disgraceful, Lucy Powell has got some very, very clear ideas of her own. She was, in my opinion, a good leader of the House, and doesn't surprise me what Jim says. I think you've got a bit of machoism within that number 10 Downing Street operation that don't like necessarily hearing uncomfortable things. So those rumours or that view that Lucy has expressed, as I say, doesn't surprise me. But, let's just deal with that issue for a second, Joe. What an absolute disgrace that people are setting this up as a Starmer versus Burnham contest when, as I say, two very talented women go for the job.
Absolutely. And Lucy Powell called it out in her interview with Nick Robinson over the weekend. And, good for her for calling it out. And it's, there is no doubt that the internal machinery of number 10 is very, very male. Now, Keir Starmer doesn't come across as a sort of a blokey bloke, but it's quite clear that he's got men around him, and the women he's had problems with, Sue Gray, Louise Hay, Angela Rayner. I mean, not necessarily because they're women. Got rid of Emily Thornberry at the first opportunity. It doesn't look good. And I think what people seem to forget, people outside of, political nerds like us, if you're the leader of the Commons, the job that you do is invaluable to constituency MPs, because you deal with the stuff about the local hospital or the pedestrian crossing outside the school or the trees that are going to be chopped down or whatever it is. And it means that those MPs can go back, they can tell their local constituency party, they can tell their local media that they're actually doing something. So that management, and as Lucy herself said, you're being a trade union leader, if you like, the shop floor leader for the constituency MPs. And if you've got the wit and the emotive intelligence, which she clearly has, to say, they're not happy about this and nobody's listening, and go away, don't worry your pretty little head about a thing, then I'm afraid, you've got to be careful, because that does come back to bite people. And there are a lot of men around the world who have, I hope, lived to rue the day that they dismissed women around them as proxies for men.
Yeah, as I say, I'm really disappointed at some of the commentary. I don't know whether this is elevating from people within Labour or whether it's just, the usual media chatter you get about this stuff. But as I say, I think if I was Keir Starmer, I would be looking at that deputy leadership contest very pragmatically, actually, and thinking, well, okay, it looks as though Lucy's going to win. She's not a troublemaker. She's not a nut. She was very, very loyal to him as leader and then Prime Minister. And so I think that he plays his cards right again. He'll be able to get her on side relatively quickly, give her a good job, and Lucy will get back stuck into whatever the party asks her to do, because she's the Labour Party to her fingertips. I don't think she's a proxy for anyone other than Lucy Powell, actually. And maybe, as you say, Joe, those backbench MPs who have been expressing some concerns about the direction of the government. But let's say that the conference does go well next week. We would anticipate Starmer then being able to continue to at least get through to the budget, Christmas and the local elections. The other rumour that's sort of starting to emerge, though, Jim, is that some of the cabinet itself are not necessarily happy with the Prime Minister's performance, or indeed Morgan McSweeney's. And the fact that we keep talking about Morgan McSweeney, I would suggest is not good news for Morgan McSweeney. You know, when the advisor becomes the story, it never usually ends well. But the other thing on the back of that, Jim, I've heard, is that, again, because of Morgan McSweeney and the Labour Together gang, they are probably having quiet conversations as to whether they would prefer to have a leadership contest sooner rather than later, which of course would exclude the Mayor of Greater Manchester.
Yes, I think you know I mean there are some. I mean, we had Peter Kyle at the Westminster reception, and he to me is one of the best performers in the government, and I think he'll be loyal to Keir Starmer. I don't think the cabinet unrest against Starmer is yet a very important factor, but I do agree with you. Once people like Morgan McSweeney become the story, he's on a thin thread. I mean, I would certainly advise him, and I don't think it's going to happen now, not to start spinning against Lucy Powell and racking up the ante about it, because otherwise when she does win, it would be seen as a defeat for his boss. So I think they'll keep their heads down, and they'll hopefully will follow the course of action that you suggested, because Lucy Powell is not hard left like some of the people that want to enter the race for the deputy leadership. And I think if Starmer plays it reasonably and embraces her, then it won't become a huge source of tension. The only thing is, persuading prime ministers to stand down, to say to Keir, best to go early to exclude Andy Burnham. The problem with that is, that the future for Keir Starmer on the back benches or back in the legal profession is not a very attractive proposition. So I don't see that as being particularly leveraged. I mean, he would respond to that by saying, I intend to turn this country around, and I intend to stay in office. I mean, it is difficult to absolutely ascertain Keir Starmer, because you can look at it in two ways. You could say that he's an unnatural he's not a natural politician. He was in the law for much longer than the average politician, and therefore will take a pragmatic view that he turned the party round. He came into office in those strange circumstances of COVID, turned the party round, saw off the Corbynites, won a massive election victory, whether it was shallow or deep, neither here nor there, and he's got them into office. And it might actually be that if the economic circumstances improve during the winter, he could actually use that as a reason to say, I've done all that and it's time to go. And that may be his view. On the other hand, what I've already said prevails, that it's very difficult to persuade the incumbent of number 10 that's in the best interest, in inverted commas, of the country for him to go.
Mm-hmm. I don't think he should go, but I'm just saying that those are the rumours that are circulating, with the dream ticket of a contest as far as the Labour Together gang would be concerned, being Wes Street and Shabana Mahmood.
Well, I don't think he should go either, because I think that would be the nail in the coffin of the Labour Party in terms of the electorate. And I think what Keir Starmer needs to do when he speaks at the conference, yes, of course, he's speaking to his members, but he also needs to spell it out loud and clear that, the way forward is, as we've discussed on this podcast many times, is to be tough. We have to reform welfare. We have to look at the possibility of ending the triple lock on pensions. We've got to make tough decisions. And if you can't make those decisions and you're not prepared to do it, then you're probably in the wrong party. I mean, I think he almost needs to be quite confrontational, if you like, with his rather weedy first term, possibly only term MPs who've got no idea of the cut and thrust and are terrified of what Nigel Farage and Reform are doing. And they're caught between, we want to do everything to help Gaza, we don't want to be nasty about immigrants, but now we've suddenly realised that people are mightily pissed off because their only hotel is being, filled up with asylum seekers. But we've always said, oh no, let's be kind. So I think the party is going through something of a sort of I don't know, a sort of a personality crisis, if you like, which is a bit of a shame when you've got the leader who's got no personality. But I do think, if he comes out and says, right, if you don't like it, then go off, join Jeremy Corbyn, that's fine. But we have a job to do, and our job, and he needs to get that message about, patriotism, not nationalism, and that sense that we are living in really dangerous times, and it is not a luxury. We haven't got the luxury of buggering about with leaders of different parties because somebody doesn't like it. The other thing I would just say about Morgan McSweeney, there is this book coming out in a couple of weeks, which has got, there have been some excerpts sort of hinted at over the weekend and last week about questions over the funding of Labour Together and questions over his due diligence, not that he did anything wrong or that he was on the fiddle or anything like that, but his reporting of funding was perhaps not as thorough as it might have been. And that's the sort of thing that might see him go.
Yeah, I think Morgan McSweeney and Keir Starmer, to an extent, they were joined at the hip. Mm-hmm. They are very long-term political partners, and I can't see Starmer sacking him unless there was something really serious. And again, it's all rumour, and people have read that book, Joe, have said to me it's crap. Actually, it's a load of shit.
I'm sure it is.
They're not that worried about it. So I think Getting as a book, in terms of if there was ever going to be damage inflicted on that inner circle of Keir Starmer's, actually it would have been that, because that basically says Morgan McSweeney is the politician in number 10. So, if he survived that, then I think any other further revelations in other books is likely to be not as damaging. But we will see. So big conference coming off for the Labour Party in Liverpool, of course, next week. I will be at the conference and I will be watching that speech with interest. I totally agree with you, Joe. I think he's got to basically roll his sleeves up and start telling a few home truths. And that, of course, will be uncomfortable for the soft left and for the supporters, perhaps, of Andy Burnham, because on the economy, I'm not sure Andy's got that many answers that are realistic either, but we'll wait and see. And as I say, interesting times ahead, I think, at that conference in Liverpool next week. But we do know that the Liberal Democrats have had their conference in Bournemouth this week. So after the break, we'll be reflecting on that. We'll be looking at the new leader of the Green Party, and we'll be talking about your party. Not my party, not your party, your party, and its trials and tribulations. And of course, we'll be taking a look at that new stance that the UK and others have taken on a Palestinian state. Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome to the second part of this week's Downtown's End Politics podcast with me, Frank McKenna, Joe Phillips and Jim Hancock. And of course, Joe is the former advisor to Liberal Democrat leader Paddy Ashdown. It was their conference this week. Ed Davey had a brass band. There was a big singing of, I don't know what it was, God Save the King or some very patriotic ditty even, which was sang in the conference hall with great gusto, I understand. The only policy pronouncement I saw that grabbed any attention was that Ed Davies said he'd be more comfortable now looking at the introduction of ID cards because of the immigration issue, of course. Joe, you will perhaps have watched a bit more of the conference than I was able to. What was your take on it?
Well, I think we'll see what happens when Ed makes his speech on Tuesday. Lib Dem conferences, as Jim knows, because he's attended not as many as me, but he's done his fair share over the years. They're quite fun. They're sort of a cross between Morris dancing the village fete and completely bonkers stuff. They're not as bonkers as they used to be. And I do remember, many years ago working for Paddy, and I slammed the door in Adam Bolton's face because there was a debate that had been selected was about, do fish feel pain? At which point you sort of think, really, are we ever going to get anywhere closer to government? And it went on for 20 minutes. I just wanted to curl up and die. I think what's interesting is there's a survey out today. Well, there are two things. One is that conference time does give the party a little bit more coverage than it normally gets, although I have noticed there's been a little bit more of Ed Davey of late, and I wonder whether the BBC is beginning to listen to what we've all said, particularly you and me, Frank, about reforms coverage. But a poll by More in Common, the think tank, suggests that party members and the general public want to see fewer stunts and more policies. And I think, while it worked during the election campaign, it's not what I would have advised Ed Davey to do, but it worked. It got him, coverage in the papers, and they stuck to three very clear things. Everyone knows where the Lib Dems stand on Europe. They're the only party still talking about social care, which is a really, really strong issue. And they've been at the forefront of the campaign against sewage in our rivers and seas and pollution. So there are those things going on. They've got 72 MPs. They've got lots and lots of council members. They've got MPs sitting on select committees. They've got a good chance to build on that. I mean, they're not doing anything particular in the polls. They are still, but they're holding steady. And even if there was an election tomorrow, and even if, this is according to the More in Common poll, even if Nigel Farage goes into number 10 with his ragtag and bobtail bunch of people, the Lib Dems would still get 100 MPs, which is astonishing, actually. So they have got the possibility to be in a position of power broker at some point in the future. They have got influence because of all those things I've just mentioned. I think, the problem for Ed Davey and people like him is that in such a febrile, vile atmosphere, not just in this country, but particularly in America, but across Europe as well, it's very hard to make decency trump division, and you'll pardon the pun on that. But I think, there is an understanding, and I think that Ed's comments about ID cards, which of course has always been anathema to the Liberal Democrats, but actually to move towards that is something that many people are beginning to think, as long as it's not a criminal offence, as long as nobody's going to come up to you and say, show me your papers. But if you have to have an ID card in order to access benefits, health, etc., and a tightening up on employment regulation and all of that sort of thing, those are the sort of practical policies that might make the UK less attractive to illegal immigrants. So I think, there are issues there. They've got to just somehow look as though they are there for the long haul. But when you think, we were just talking about Keir Starmer, taking the Labour Party out of the doldrums of Jeremy Corbyn and bringing it back. I mean, look at the Lib Dems after the coalition, absolutely slaughtered, down to 10, 12 MPs, and now they've got 72. So they must be doing something right. And the fact that they are in control or shared control of so many councils around the country, it allows people to see how they work in office. And I think that is significant.
Jim, Ed Davey's speech, as Joe said, is tomorrow, Tuesday. So what would you be advising him to be going for? And is it time for him to drop the stunts? Because if you are taken to the airwaves and quite rightly complaining about the coverage of reform and the lack of attention that the Liberal Democrats have had with their 70-odd MPs, would a journalist not push back and say, well, if you want to take us seriously, Ed, you're going to have to start acting a bit more seriously?
I'm conflicted on this because, getting yourself heard is very difficult, and stunts do provide that sort of coverage. The television can't resist them. And also, I've been struck by his defence of his stunts by saying, you've got to have a bit of humour in politics, because often humour is as effective as bitter criticism. And me not taking myself too seriously, he hopes is an attractive feature. But as in Joe's reference to whether fish feel pain, there's always that slight concern. The Liberal Democrats really aren't serious, and they just want to be a debating society. So there's always that thing. I'm conflicted about it. I think providing the stunt is well thought through, and they're not too frequent, I wouldn't rule them out altogether. I think the main thing he's got to do in his speech tomorrow is to stand for decency. It is very difficult in a polarized world. But I hope my country, or most people in my country, still do have an appetite for a decent country, a tolerant country, a progressive country, and an attempt to detoxify the poisonous way in which social media go on. And to be fair to Davey, he's really gone for Elon Musk. I mean, he's almost called for. Nick Robinson was questioning him today about whether he should be arrested or not for criminal activity, because what Musk has done in removing safeguards, even the allegation is, according to Ed Davey, about child pornography adverts appearing on his site. It's absolutely intolerable. So he's got that sort of courage. He's got courage over demanding that we get on with social care. He's actually calling for a customs union with Europe, which I think is the other thing he's got to be courageous about, and hope that there can be a sort of a centre coalition against what we're going to face with Reform UK. Just finally, the question, the everlasting question that will have come up during Joe's tenure with Paddy Ashdown and so on: would you do a deal with one of the other parties? Now, they're not even asking whether he do a deal with the Tories anymore, but on the Labour front, he would not answer the question. I think his answer to that, if I was media training him, and I do have a media training company available, would be I'm fighting for every vote, and not ruling it in or out. I mean, it depends on the mathematics after the election, but my urge is for everyone to vote for the Liberal Democrats. But at this stage, that particular strategic question is just over the horizon. But that may have to be the configuration. Reform versus decent middle of the road party. But the middle of the road has got to be, my last word on this, sorry, go on, is that middle of the road decency has got to be fought for, and it's got to be defined in a way, because in a way it is a bit vague, and it's not going to attract clicks. This is the problem, and I'll be interested to know how he actually handles this. But he's got to show some courage in fighting for a slightly nebulous concept, if you want.
Yeah, I think his speech is important tomorrow. We might actually reflect on it if he says anything particularly interesting next week. I hope he does, because I actually think the Liberal Democrats have got a chance in some areas of increasing their take-in vote. And if it was down to me, obviously, I would want to see Labour recover and take us on to much better things. But in the absence of that, I'd much prefer the prospect of a progressive alliance between the Liberal Democrats, Labour and others than I would the spectre of a reform government. So good luck to Ed Davey and the Liberal Democrats for the remainder of their conference. I want to move on to the further to the left of the Liberal Democrats, and that is the trials and tribulations of Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana's new political party. Well, it's not a political party as yet, and will it ever get off the ground? It's called at this moment in time Your Party, and last week, in a nutshell, this is a controversy that sort of been simmering, I think, between Zara Sultana and Jeremy Corbyn. Doesn't surprise me, does surprise some of the younger members in our office who had this Your Party as a big hope for them on the left. I did expect it to fall apart, but not as quickly as it has. Anyway, Zara sent an email out without telling her colleagues to the 300,000 database that she had, urging people to join Your Party. It's about 55 quid a head, I think it was. And then Jeremy and his colleagues from the Independents in the Commons, which are the people who basically stood on pro-Palestine tickets the last general election, said that she'd acted unilaterally and people should cancel their direct debits or standing orders. Wasn't something that should have happened. Subsequently, Zara Sultana threatened legal action against Jeremy Corbyn and his colleagues. She's now withdrawn that threat. But it's all a bit of a mess. And for someone of a certain age, as us three all are, we've seen this play out before, guys, haven't we? The hard left can never, ever, ever get their act together. And the one thing that did strike me as being particularly accurate from Zara Sultana's comments was there is an awful lot of misogyny
Yeah.
in the hard left of politics. Always has been, always will be. And again, something I've said often, not that much difference actually between the hard left and the hard right. So I'm not surprised. I'm a bit disappointed for Zara Sultana, who I think, despite the fact that she doesn't share my politics, is a talented politician, young, vibrant, dynamic, has a good way of getting a message across. But she's been caught up with the wrong people. And if you look at just one issue, trans rights, and you look at those people she's trying to work alongside who stood on the pro-Palestinian ticket, and then you just take that one issue alone, how they ever thought that party was going to be able to progress is beyond me. Joe?
Well, I think, in just talking about the Liberal Democrats and Jim said about student politics, this, your party, it's your party, you can cry if you want to, is absolutely student politics. And it's ridiculous. I mean, I am getting sick and tired, as I'm sure many people are, of this self-indulgence of people, particularly on the left, who wed themselves to one particular issue, whether it's Palestine or trans rights or whatever it might be. Back in my days when I was a student, it was sort of Nicaragua or something else. But you just sort of think, come on, guys, there's an awful lot of crap going on in the world. We've got Russia going, hello, NATO, woohoo, I'm here in Estonia, oh, I'm in Romania, I'm in Finland, we've got really serious stuff going on around the world, and we've got people who are tearing themselves apart. And meanwhile, people like Nigel Farage are looking on going, well, that's okay. While they're fighting, we'll just march on. And that is the problem, and it doesn't help the left. And all of those people who think that Keir Starmer has taken the Labour Party too far to the right or the centre, well, what are you going to do if you can't even agree on the name for your party or how to fund it? I mean, it's embarrassing, frankly.
And of course, the other challenge they have is now you've got Zach Polanski, who's really good communicator, don't necessarily share his politics, but an energy, a voice, good on the media. I think he was an actor, wasn't he, by trade? And you can tell in terms of the way
he was a hypnotist. He used to hypnotize
even better.
Yeah,
let's send him around to all the Reform voters and tell them to take the label off their don't drink, off the bleach bottles.
He claimed that women could increase their breast size through hypnotism.
Well, Joe, Joe, she
Yeah.
always takes us into these realms of fantasy, James, does she not? I mean, but on a serious note, Zach Polanski has give people like Corbyn a problem because he's younger, he's fresher, the green agenda supported by many, many young people. And I think that Zara Sultana, for example, may have a better future in actually teaming up with the Greens than she does with, as Joe said, the youth politician Jeremy Corbyn, who's 75 and still prefers protest to power.
Yes, it's rather dangerous for me on a small sample to make this following remark, but I have been in the company of quite a large number of younger people in the last week or so, and one in particular who has left the Labour Party and joined the Greens has partly done so because this person is inspired by Zach Polanski and the clear way in which he's stating his policies, but also a feeling that Jeremy Corbyn is, with respect, yesterday's man. And quite apart from all this toing and froing about the name of the party and his tensions with Zara Sultana, I think Polanski has a real opportunity here of appealing to people on the radical, let's not call it hard, let's call it the radical left. I have already referred to my worries within the Greens that some of the environmentalists who haven't got an appetite for all the Polanski's things, they may have problems with the way Polanski's going to take the party, but he is in a position to really benefit from people who are just not in, have become disillusioned with Labour, but don't really see the sort of Corbyn project as being something that's very attractive.
I think by the time we get to the next general election, a lot of these conversations will be null and void. I think it's probably going to be a fact, because although people say, well, they've got 11% in the polls, and when you break that down constituency by constituency, and this is the fact of first past the post systems, rightly or wrongly, then they would still probably only end up with the same number of MPs and seats that they've got now. What they can do, of course, though, and this is the worry for Labour in particular, is chip away at Labour's support. So in those more marginal seats, you end up with a Reform or a Conservative MP because Labour have lost a couple of thousand votes to the Greens, and that's why it's such an important point to make in terms of these parties as whether they're doing well or not.
And if you're, bringing the voting age down to 16 and 17, then Zach Polanski, one of the things that makes him attractive is he is the leader of the Greens as opposed to one of the co-leaders, which makes it a lot easier for broadcasters to go, right, we need to speak to your leader. He needs to be on Question Time or whatever it is, instead of, well, whose turn is it this week? And already he is probably as well known as Caroline Lucas, who absolutely stuck her ground and did a very lonely battle, but flew the flag very successfully for many, many years. And I think, he will have a voice. And I think what will happen is that, yes, you're absolutely right, Frank, by the time we get to the election, we probably won't be having these sort of conversations. But you will see a sort of a natural settling, if you like. Tobias Ellwood, who I actually have a lot of time for, no longer a Conservative MP, but was a defence minister. And he wrote a really interesting piece about following the defection of Danny Kruger to Reform, the first sitting Tory MP and shadow minister to Reform, so a big scalp for them. But he said, we will lose some more people, but that means that we can re-find the centre. And it goes back to that thing that you were both saying about the decency, that there is a point surely where people will just get weary of the constant shouting, screaming, fighting and vitriol and go, actually, I just want somebody to fix the potholes, or I just want to know I can get a doctor's appointment, and I want to have somebody to have a conversation with. And I think Zach Polanski might, he might be a little bit too zealous for some of the more traditional, if you like, traditional environmentalists.
We will wait and see. I mean, my fear is that the genie is out of the bottle in terms of discourse in this country, and it seems to me to be getting more and more extreme. And the fact that most polls now are showing immigration is the big issue in this country, when again, anyone who's looked at the numbers, the figures and the things that the government are doing would say, well, that's an issue that at least we've got some sort of plan to sort out. It's just baffling to me, but there you go. Let's see what happens over the next months and years as far as that's concerned. The final issue to talk about today, it's probably the most important one that we've discussed actually, and that is Palestine, the recognition of the Palestinian state by Keir Starmer over the weekend. That announcement, of course, has been well trailed, because he's been saying to Netanyahu and the Israelis, if you don't start to act in accordance with international law in terms of the way you've reacted recently in the Gaza Strip, then we will recognise, have no option but to recognise a Palestinian state. Now, this is an issue that I bow to your two's experience on rather than mine. Instinctively, I think this was not just the right move for Keir Starmer to make in terms of the moral argument in case, but politically essential for him to make this move as well. But James, I know that you, again, somebody who's been reporting on this issue for 99 years, will have a lot to say.
You're obviously referring to my following the British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour's declaration in 1917, when we were all summoned to a Victorian sort of room in Whitehall. I remember it well. The smoke filled the air. Now, this is too serious to go on with jokes about this. I mean, the point about the Balfour Declaration was, and some people are saying that all those years later, Britain has finally recognised its full responsibilities, because what it said was a homeland for the Jews, and then it went on to say, but nothing should affect the rights of the existing Arab population, which at that point was 80–90% of the people living in the historic land of Palestine. For all sorts of reasons we haven't got time to go into now, the Jewish state was set up, and the Palestinian people fled largely, and Britain's been blamed by the Arabs ever since for not, in the 1920s, establishing maybe a Jewish homeland and a Palestinian state. My concern is that the reaction, of course, of Israel is that the extreme right now are calling for annexation of the West Bank, a greater Israel. I don't think Netanyahu is yet going to go down that route, but it's going to polarize things. And as we said last week, you can recognize Palestine all you like, but it doesn't conform to the international rules about boundaries that are identifiable, a government that's identifiable, and a population that's fully identifiable. There's a lack of realism on all sides. I heard a Palestinian spokesman this morning, quite an experienced man, saying, the settlers could be removed in 6 days and the Israelis could relax on the 7th day. Apart from the slightly, xenophobic, anti-Semitic tone of that particular phrase, there's a lack of realism on all sides. There is a conference, as I understand it, going on in New York alongside the meeting of the General Assembly to try and actually map a path to 2 states. And I always like to get down to what are the practicalities of this. But, at the moment, I understand what you're saying. I think you're probably right that Starmer could not resist within the Labour Party any longer the need to do this. I understand that, but I'm always queasy about dealing with international issues of this importance just to settle an internal Labour Party argument. I know that's not just why he's done it, and I've outlined the historic reasons why he's done it. But it's a very difficult situation, and it's likely to make no difference. And we're just going to have to endure what Hamas have done, as saying, "Yippee!" This is all the result of that ghastly stuff that they did on the 7th of October. Those are the political risks.
The good thing, as far as Starmer will be concerned, Joe, is that he's not on his own. So Canada, Australia, Portugal, France, others have said, yes, we're going to recognise a Palestinian state. And again, we go back to that Trump visit last week, and clearly they had agreed to disagree on that particular issue. And Trump wasn't overly critical of the UK's stance as far as that was concerned. Again, I know you're very experienced in terms of following what's happened in the Middle East. What's your take on this latest development?
Well, first of all, it's important to remember that the British government voted in 2014 to recognise the state of Palestine when the time was right, in order to pursue a 2-state solution. It's also worth mentioning, as was mentioned on the radio this morning, it's 32 years since Bill Clinton presided over the signing of a peace deal between Israel and the Palestinians, and nothing has happened. I think it is largely symbolic, but I think you're absolutely right. The fact that we are doing it in concert with those other countries is hugely important in terms of the isolation of Israel. And this further isolation of Israel will be is uncomfortable for many Israelis in that country and living abroad. I think what is so appalling is that we have all sat by and watched while settlers have moved into the West Bank, and we've gone, that's naughty, tut tut, it's against international law, and have done nothing about it. And I think there will be the Israelis are cross about this, there's no doubt about it. But they're cross pretty much about everything. But I think what we now need to see, instead of Yvette Cooper saying you mustn't annex, the West Bank, well, I'm sure Netanyahu is going, oh my God, Yvette Cooper, how terrifying. It's not going to happen, is it? So I do think, the international community, even if it is these countries that recognise the Palestinian state, have got to somehow or other put real pressure. And that means stop selling arms, stop trading with Israel, stop visas if necessary for people coming to this country. Don't entertain the Israeli president. We've talked about Donald Trump. The Israeli president was in the UK the week before, which many people will have found absolutely abhorrent, even though his position is largely ceremonial. So I think, if you're going to make it more than a gesture, then you've got to bind together and find a way of dealing with the settler issue. My feeling is that I fear that the damage to Gaza has been so extraordinarily appalling that there is no hope of rebuilding Gaza. So maybe what we have to do is look at internationally how you create a safe place, and even if that means having UN peacekeepers to maintain a safe space for the Palestinian people who've been absolutely appallingly treated.
The one thing that the comments that both of you have made have highlighted is that this is another one of those complex, complicated issues that doesn't have a simple black and white answer. We've talked about this issue on many occasions, and it's the first time I think we haven't referenced, we need to, the thing that kickstarted this latest spate of absolute atrocities, which was that absolutely atrocious attack by Hamas on Israel on the 7th of October, a couple of years ago now. And I think that, if simple gestures such as we will recognise a two-state solution was the answer, then that would have been something that had been delivered, as you say, Joe. Clinton tried to do it 32 years ago. So we're far away from that, I'm afraid. And I think that the only thing I can see is this conflict getting worse before it gets better. It's absolutely disgraceful. And the other thing that I always remind people who are very exercised and pro-Palestinian is that the vast majority of Israeli people do not support the tactics that have been used by Netanyahu again in Gaza, and indeed have been denied the democratic opportunity of having their say, because of course the country is in a state of war, and therefore Netanyahu has not only been able to avoid a democratic opinion of the Israeli public, but also a case against him, a legal case against him, which is no doubt likely to find him guilty of corruption.
Yeah, so this is a question. It's not a loaded question, Frank. If there was an election, do you think there's any possibility that the Israeli people, if your view about their views is clear, I haven't seen enough polls. I'm fascinated to know what would elect a different government, and a different government to the point where they were prepared to negotiate a two-state solution. I think that's a real ask. You might get a slightly more moderate government, so you can get rid of these Ben Gvir people out of it. But would they still be prepared to negotiate that? That's a very interesting question.
Well, I think they probably would without Hamas, and I think therefore you would then have the Palestinian Authority perhaps being able to regroup, supported by international efforts, whether that's Qatar or the UAE or other, European and Commonwealth countries, if you like. But I do think, you're absolutely right. All the time Netanyahu is in power to keep himself out of prison. And I think the last figure I saw was that 70% of Israelis are completely opposed to what he's doing and how he is prosecuting this war. And there's huge.
But are they in favour of a two-state solution? No,
I'm not convinced, Jim. I don't think they are, but I don't think that mitigates against the point I'm making, which you could get a much more moderate administration in Israel that would bring us closer to peace. But again, I did a podcast with Louise Ellman very recently, and she said, I've always been in favour of a two-state solution, always been a two-state person. But the practicalities of that are really, really challenging, aren't they? Because, again, as Joe says, well, if it didn't include Hamas, but where is the confidence, if you're an Israeli, of saying, well, we know these negotiations are going to take place in good faith, and Hamas is nowhere near to be seen? Because the fear that they would have, and it's a legitimate fear, is that behind the scenes, Hamas are driving those negotiations, and as soon as those negotiations and that state is set up, then they move in again. So, as I say, this is a complex and complicated issue. No one has been more appalled than I at the way in which the Israelis have conducted themselves in terms of this conflict. But we should not forget that it's not simply a case of saying we're all pro-Palestine
No, absolutely.
Israel good. Hamas good, Israel bad, because, as I say, it's far more complex than that. So in answer to your question, Jim, I think the Israelis would elect a more moderate government,
Yeah.
but I don't think anybody who was standing on a platform saying two-state solution would necessarily be elected. And therein lies your problem, yeah? You need a president of the United States who is serious about finding a peaceful solution there, and then maybe you've got a chance. That's not going to happen for some time, I'm afraid. We're saying 3 years. Trump has his way. It'll be a lot longer than that, and that's an issue we'll come back to either next week or the week afterwards. Our good friend from across the pond in the States, Martin Littropt, is going to be joining us for a podcast, and we're going to be talking all things America and Donald Trump with him then. We will be back with you next week. Time to be confirmed, because, as I mentioned, we've got a fringe event at the Labour Party conference next Monday morning with Andy Burnham, Luciana Berger and Trevor Stephen. So we will work out when we are going to get our next Downtown Den Politics podcast to you. But enjoy the rest of your week, and thanks for listening.